with Geetarthamu. Now we have something that all of us have been waiting for, Sri Ram Venkatakrishna's lecture. Today's lecture is on the disciples of Tyagaraja and their lineages. Just a short exponent, Sri Saraswati Bhai. He's presently the secretary of the Music Academy, and he needs no more introduction from me. Are in for a treat.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Before I begin this presentation, I must thank Mr. Raghavan, who wouldn't take no for an answer. He wanted me to come last year for this presentation. Last year I had to cancel at the last minute, and I said I'm not even traveling to the United States. And then he said, I'm giving you the dates for the next year. Make sure that you plan accordingly, which I did. And I'm very grateful, sir, to you for having arranged this talk. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. So today's presentation is about Tyagaraja and his disciples. The topic was given by Mr. Raghavan to me. And this is the first time I'm presenting this particular subject. I have done Tyagaraja, I have done other topics, but Tyagaraja and his disciples, for the first time, I'm taking it up today. And before I begin, I must say that Tyagaraja, we all refer to him as Saint Tyagaraja. We say that he is the greatest among the Carnatic music composers. Dr. Raghavan calls him the tone poet of humanity. We know that among the corpus of songs, this is perhaps not the largest corpus of songs. Definitely Annamacharya would be head and shoulders above in terms of number. Purandara Dasa, if you go by what he writes, definitely composed a lot more than Tyagaraja. But when it comes to the most popular composer, the composer with the maximum variety in terms of emotions, in terms of subjects, in terms of treatment of raga, in terms of rhythm, in terms of themes, you can go on and on and on. Tyagaraja is the greatest. He is like Mozart in Western classical music. The only difference is that Mozart lived for a very short while, Tyagaraja lived for a very long period of time. In an era when the average life expectancy was around 40 years, Tyagaraja lived up to the age of 80. He was a very old man when he passed away, going by the standards of that time. Today's longevity is completely different, and we cannot measure what was then. All I would say was this was a genius. He was an extraordinary mind, and he worked very hard at his compositions. Sometimes we deny him all that recognition when we consider him to be a miracle worker, and we consider, avar vaaya tharanda avar paadinde irundar. That may be so, but it was the result of enormous hard work, and he put in my opinion, he put in a lot of effort into his compositions to create those ragas that he did. Now, that is one side of the work of this great man. The other is the extraordinary time in which he chose to be born. Purandara Dasa composed 4,75,000 compositions. Purandara Dasa says, I have composed 4,75,000 compositions on the Lord. We don't have more than a few hundreds. And we definitely don't have the tunes of any of them. And all of them have been tuned later. If you look at Annamacharya, we know that there are 32,000 compositions, of which 16,000 are available, again, not with a tune. So, Tyagaraja was born at a very unique cusp in world. He was a product of being himself. So, we'll just go to the next slide. This village of Thiruvayyaru, this is a very rare photograph of the Kaveri in full flow in Thiruvayyaru. Normally, when you go there, you'll find children playing cricket in the mud. But that is sometime when I visited Karnataka was to enter Thiruvayyaru. Now, the families used to live here. In summer, just behind this is the river. So they would get down from here, go and do the Varuna Japam in the sand till the rains came. This was the idea. Tyagaraja's father had done such a superb job of distributing the land that the king was very happy, and he gave Tyagaraja's father 2.5 acres, 5 acres of land in Pashupati Kovil, which is not very far from Tiruvayar. And he also gave him a house to live in Tirmanjana Vidhi in Tiruvayar, and that is how the family comes to live here. And after King, this is a very old photograph of living in the 20th, 21st century, and we believe that these things don't look good any longer. You know, we need to beautify it. You put up what you think is beautiful, which is a concrete structure with grills in gold color and all that. So the entire thing has gone away. This used to be Tyagaraja's house. And that was his brother Japyesha's house. All that has completely vanished. So Tyagaraja lived in this particular property, and this is where all his disciples must have come. Now, the reason why I'm bringing the disciples in is prior to the 18th century. Now, we must give the British some credit. The British themselves had, they made travel easy. For a long time, South India, after the collapse of the Vijayanagara Empire, there had not been, you couldn't move around with safety. You could hardly move around between village and village. And the records say that unless you were forced to, you never stepped out of your village. But with the coming of the British by 1799 and their takeover of Tanjavur, Tyagaraja was born in 1767. We are talking about the time when he was around 32 years old. At that time, when the British had taken over the whole of Tanjavur, and communications became very easy between Madras, between Mysore and other areas, and Tiruvayar. And gradually, the news began to spread about this man called Tyagaraja, who is composing and who is singing over here. And the city of Madras and the princely states of Mysore, Travancore, the Zamindaris of Ramanathapuram, Sivaganga, they all didn't have any reason to fight any longer. Pudukkottai, the British were taking care of everything, so the kings had a lot of time to look at the arts once again. Tanjavur at this time was losing its sheen as a center of the arts because the Maratha Empire had been absorbed into the East India Company. And therefore, the rest of the towns needed performing artists. So the arts was becoming a very popular earning business. It's like the IT industry today. It's like AI today. So you keep following wherever there is economic potential, you go in that direction. So there was Carnatic music, and more important than Carnatic music was Harikatha. The telling of stories accompanied by music with lot of humor, multiple languages, spontaneity. That was the great art form at that time. So lots of people began to know about Tyagaraja, and several people began to come here and learn music from him. In a composition of his, Dasarathi, he says, Asadira Duradeshamuna Prakashamu Chesina Rasika Shiromani. To my satisfaction, Rama, to my satisfaction, Asadira Duradeshamuna, in faraway lands, you have made me famous. Prakashamu Chesina Rasika Shiromani. Oh Rama, Rasika Shiromani, oh fan, oh king of fans, you have understood my music. You have made me famous in faraway lands. Now, where was he? What are these faraway lands that he was talking about? He was talking about Mysore. He was talking about Travancore. He was talking about Madras city. He was talking about Salem. He was, all these places. 300 years earlier, if he had been born, nobody would have heard of him. But this was the time when disciples were able to come from various places, stay with Tyagaraja in that particular house, learn music from him, depart, and carry forward the compositions to various places. This was point number one. Next slide, please. They would have accompanied Tyagaraja to the river. They would have had, had their bath over there along with him. They would have heard him worshipping the river Kaveri. Then they would have, next slide. They would have gone to the Panchanadishwara temple, where Tyagaraja composed more than 10 songs on Panchanadishwara or Panchapagesha and Dharma Samvardhini. And perhaps the students must have practiced in the big halls of this particular temple. But remember that at that time, Tiruvayar was just not Carnatic music. This is what normally we do. We believe that அந்த காலத்துல அங்க நிறைய கர்நாடக சங்கீதம் கேட்டுட்டு இருந்தது. That is not the only thing. There was a lot of Tamil discoursing going on. There was a lot of Veda Parayanam going on. There was a lot of Marathi Kirtan going on in these places. Just next to Tyagaraja's house, just 5 minutes away, there is a street called Balu Mudali Street. In that, there is a Panduranga temple. And that Panduranga temple was created by King Tulaja I, 100 years before Tyagaraja. Abhangs were heard over there from the morning till the night, continuously during Tyagaraja's time. Which is why in his Prahlada Bhakti Vijayam, he just does not stop with paying tribute to Bhadrachala Ramadasa, to Purandaradasa. His canvas was very big. So where does he start from? He starts from Tulsidas. Ramcharitmanas. He says he starts with Tulasidasa, then he comes to all the bhakti poets of Maharashtra. Tukarama, Namadeva, Sahadeva, Jnanadeva, he mentions all of them. Then he comes to Purandaradasa, he talks about Bhadrachala Ramadasa. So he knew about the Marathi Kirtan tradition, which is why you sometimes feel that is, he's always considered to be the man who brought Mishra Chapu and Khanda Chapu into Carnatic music. Where did he get it from? He got it from the Marathi Kirtan tradition, with the chipli in hand, singing in that beat, that usitalam, which is used so often in Harikatha, all of which he would incorporate into the field of Carnatic music. So these students were absorbing that also. Next slide, please. They would have all participated in the Saptasthanam festival, when Panchanadishwara will set out in a glass palanquin in summer along with Dharma Samvardhini, and then the palanquin will be carried via the river to 6 other temples. And from each of the other temples, that temple's palanquin will join the procession. Finally, there will be 7 palanquins that will come back to Thiruvayyaru. During this entire journey, Bhagavatas will be following, singing songs as the procession goes on for a whole day and a whole night. When you look at Mutsata Brahmadulaku Dorakuna, that is what Tyagaraja is describing. He is describing this particular procession in that festival where he says Shiva is sitting in that palanquin and he is not able to see Parvati, so his eyes are scanning in the distance as to where she is, when all the Bhagavatottamas are singing along with him and they are going in that particular procession. So it was today when you go to Thiruvayyaru, it's a dead town, except when you go during the Aradhana. Otherwise, it's bus is going here and there, hardly anybody knowing about the place. But during Tyagaraja's time, it was a very lively center. So these students who would have come, they would have all absorbed everything that was going on. Next slide, please. This is the pavilion of Sharboji, Raja Sharfoji, who was a contemporary of Tyagaraja. And he built this particular pavilion known as the Kalyan Mahal, so that he could come here in summer and relax. They must have been witness to all that. Next. They must have had an idea as to how Tyagaraja really looked. We don't know. But this particular portrait was made when Tyagaraja was alive. So this is how he must have looked. You can see that this is no weakling. He's got sharp, beady eyes, and he's gazing into you. He's pouring into your soul. He's able to make out. He's a very sharp individual. A man who could write lines like, Pranamu leni daniki baguga bangaru chutti. That is, for a dead body, you're putting gold ornaments. So, lines, he was so sharp and stinging in some of his comments that he uses in his compositions. This was not some weakling, who was allowing life to go on and, he was suffering at the hands of everybody. On the other hand, next slide, please. This is how we interpret Tyagaraja today because of S. Rajam's portrait. In fact, today, if Tyagaraja comes and stands and he doesn't look like this, we'll be very disappointed. This is the ISO 9001 portrait of Tyagaraja today. So, next, please. Next. We have these interpretations also. Very weak, brooding, no strength at all. Somehow Tyagaraja doesn't fit this image. Even when he is upset with Rama, he is fighting with Rama. He says, who has been happy after worshipping you? This is all the kinds of comments that he makes in his compositions. He's a tough guy. That is how I would like to think of Tyagaraja. Next slide. They would have been witness to Tyagaraja involving himself in commercial transactions. That is how we think of him today. This was a man who sold the backyard of his house for a certain sum of money. He was witnessing this. This is the palm leaf manuscripts that records that sale of that backyard to Lagubai and Bayamabai, 2 women of the royal family of Tanjavur, and how much money he has got. And we always say that his brother was so evil. The brother was dead by the time this transaction happened, and the brother's son has signed as a witness in this. So obviously, there are several stories that we have created over a period of time. Next slide, please. Finally, they would have been witness to Tyagaraja's passing. He's becoming a sannyasi 3 days before dying. We do know in Giripai, he says, Guritappaga Kanti, unerringly I saw. He's sure that he saw Rama. And he says it 3 times. Guritappaga Kanti, Kanti, Kanti. Moonu tharava he says, Paathen. And he knows that Rama has come, and Rama says, Padiputulapai. That is 5 days and 5 nights. I will give you salvation. And having sung of Rama right through life, when Rama comes, Tyagaraja is not able to say anything. That is the irony of it all. Pulakankitudai, Ashrita Pulakitudai, that is, I was so overwhelmed that I could only mumble. Whole life he had spent singing, but when Rama came, he couldn't open his mouth. It must have been very galling for this individual. Then he becomes a sannyasi, and finally he is buried here. And then the next slide, please. And we know about the next slide. We know about the construction of the Samadhi. That's a different story altogether. The arrival of Bangalore Nagaratnamma and what she did and how the Samadhi became what it is today. That's a very long and a very interesting story that can be told at some other time. So we now go on to the story of the disciples. So we have a huge list. In fact, Professor Sambamurthy lists 25 disciples of Tyagaraja, all of whom he says were very famous in their time. But some of them are dismissed with one line, great performer, known in this particular area. So these are all not names that we are not able to fathom anymore. So I have only taken a set of disciples of whom there is a cognitive, well-defined history. And I'm going to talk about how each of these disciples made Tyagaraja what Tyagaraja is today. Without these disciples, his songs would have never made it to the wider platform. Remember that Tyagaraja died in 1847. Within 9 years of that, the first Carnatic book had been printed. And we have a copy of that book in the Music Academy, in the library, the original edition. In that, you have Tyagaraja Kritis. Veena Ramanujaya has written what is called the Sangeeta Sarvartha Sara Sangrahamu. That's the name of the book. Printed by Bhuvanagiri Rangayya Garu in the Girvana Bhasha Ratnakara Press in Madras. And this book contains compositions of Tyagaraja. So within 9 years of Tyagaraja's passing, printing technology. Prior to that, everybody was writing with the help of palm leaves and styluses. And that learning was limited to the person who had the palm leaf. Tomorrow when we go to Muthuswami Dikshita's life, we will see how much difficult it was to get material out of people who had palm leaf manuscripts scripts with them. But this was democratization of knowledge. Today, ella Google la internet la potten. Digitize panniten. This is the early digitization, And by the 1840s, the East India Company had permitted Indian language books to come out. So by 1857, you have this book, 1856, you have this Sangeeta Sarvartha Sara Sangrahamu. So book publishing is starting out. Tyagaraja's works are going to be coming out. At that time, look at the disciples, Mahar Nombu Chavadi Venkata Subayar. Then we have the Valajapetai Parampare, the Thillaisthanam Parampare, the Umayalpuram Parampare. Typically, these are the 3 that will be listed as Tyagaraja's disciple lineage. Valajapet, Thillaisthanam, Umayalpuram. Then you've got Veena Kuppayar, who brings the Madras school of Tyagaraja's disciples. Lalgudi Ramayar, who doesn't need any introduction. And then Naikarapati Seshayar, Subbayar actually it should not be Sheshayar, and Subraya Shastri. These are all the famous disciples of Tyagaraja, about whom I'll be mentioning in brief today during the remaining time of this presentation. So Mahar Nombu Chavadi itself is a locality which is just outside Tanjavur, and today it's a part of Tanjavur itself. There is no marker for Venkata Subayar. Actually, I tried high and low to get a portrait of his, but there isn't any such portrait. But when I went and visited this particular Mahar Nombu Chavadi, the most interesting part of it is this Mission Sannadhi street. Mission Sannadhi, basically there's a church of St. Peter over there. And the man who made St. Peter's Church famous was a contemporary of Tyagaraja, Vedanayagam Shastriyar. Vedanayakam Shastriyar was a close friend of, not Vedanayakam Pillai, Vedanayakam Shastriyar, who was a very close friend of Sharfoji, and who took Tyagaraja's tunes and wrote songs for the church. And even today, his descendants, they perform Kuravanjis in the church using those ragas and tunes. So all of you have heard Sujana Jeevana Rama Suguna Bhushana Rama Sujana Jeevana Parama Pavana Papa Vimochana Sima Parama Pavana. That's the Christian equivalent of the Tyagaraja composition. So that is in Maharnobu Chavadi. And this Venkata Subbayar doesn't have anything to do with the church. Now, don't assume that he was part of it. He was Tyagaraja's cousin. Tyagaraja's father's sister's son, probably. Venkata Subbayar was probably the earliest disciple of Tyagaraja. And under him would emerge a huge lineage, which for some surprising reason, nobody appears to give Venkata Subbayar the credit for it. We always say, Tyagaraja Shisaipadna, Balajapetaya, Umayalpurama, Tilesthanama. They forget that there was a huge lineage that was there. We'll now go through that. Next slide. So, Mahavaidyanath Iyer and Patnam Subramanya Iyer, both of them were disciples of Maharnobu Chavadi Venkata Subbayar. So, Mahavaidyanath Iyer, you know, Mela Raga Malika, the first superstar of Carnatic music. Today, when we say superstar of Carnatic music, Sanjay Subramanyam. But in that era, it was Mahavaidyanath Sivan who was the superstar of Carnatic music. The first man to have his voice recorded. The first man to have his entire life history documented by a disciple. We know exactly what went on in his life on a practically day-to-day basis. That was the level of adulation for this personality. Patnam Subramanya Iyer, the great composer. The word Patnam is Chennapatnam, Madras. By the time Madras was becoming a greater and greater center for music, Subramanya Iyer comes to Madras, teaches the Devadasis music in the city, composes, and becomes a great name. And the word Chennapatnam becomes Patnam, and that is how we refer to him. So these were the two great lineages that would come from Maharnobu Chavadi, Venkata Subbayar. When we go a little further down this slide, Mahavaidyanath Sivan's disciples, Paramarneri Swaminatha Iyer, who was a great authority on Padams and also on the Jayadeva Ashtapadi, and he was also what is today a bit of a wonder, he was a voco violinist. He would accompany himself singing and would play the violin. And we know nothing about him beyond the fact that he was the first musician to be made the president of the Music Academy's annual conference. So he's our first Sangeeta Kalanidhi, so to speak. Beyond that, and this photograph, we have really nothing about him. Then we have Govinda Sivam, previous slide, the other picture, Sabesa Iyer, whose father, Govinda Sivam, had learnt from Tyagaraja himself, and Sabesa Iyer had learnt from Mahavaidyanath Iyer. Sabesa Iyer would create another long, very long lineage, which I will take you through. Next slide, please. One of the most famous disciples of Sabesa Iyer is Harikesanallur Muttaya Bhagavatar. This Guru-Shishya relationship was not exactly a comfortable one. There was a lot of animosity between Sabesa Iyer, who resented Muttaya Bhagavatar's popularity. But Muttaya Bhagavatar, being a very gregarious and a happy-go-lucky personality, pushed aside all those differences of opinions and maintained a very great relationship with Sabesa Iyer. The other one was Musri Subramanya Iyer. Musri was also a disciple of Sabesa Iyer. And we know from Musri that Sabesa Iyer was a master in performing Niraval. And Musri himself was a master in Niraval. I don't know how many of you have heard his YouTube recordings, his Nagumomu and all that. He was an absolute wizard with a very nuanced style of rendition. And today, the Sabesa Iyer lineage in the Music Academy history accounts for the maximum number of Sangeeta Kalanidhis. The Sabesa Iyer, Musri Subramanya Iyer, T.K. Govindarao, Saroja Lalita, then, you have a huge list of names. That's the maximum number, followed by the Muttaya Bhagavatar. So, right up to T.N. Seshagopalan and downwards, everybody comes from this particular lineage. Next slide, please. The Patnam lineage was not any less. The oldest disciple of Patnam Subramanya Iyer was Ramanathapuram Puchi Srinivasa Iyengar, who was, one of the greatest composers, performers, Asthana Vidwan of Ramanathapuram Zameen. And the youngest disciple was Mysore Vasudevachar, whose portrait you see on the extreme left. Mysore Vasudevachar, who was Asthana Vidwan of the Mysore court, and in my opinion, the most melodious of all composers. Not even Tyagaraja can hold a candle to Vasudevachar when it comes to sheer melody. There was something about Mysore which encouraged melody more than laya. And the way he created compositions, you know that it's a Mysore Vasudevachar piece the moment it is begun to be sung. He was an absolute genius. And the other side, you have Tiger Varadacharya. Tiger, who was known as Tiger because of his mannerisms while singing. The Maharaja of Mysore called him a lion, and he would maintain a letterhead that would say Tiger, Lion, Varadacharya. And he was not so much a performer as he was a pedagogue. He would teach music. So he went on to head 4 great institutions. The Music Academy's Teachers College of Music, the Department of Music, Madras University, head of the department of the Annamalai University, and finally Kalakshetra. These were the 4 great institutions that Tiger would lay his impress upon. And then we have had a long lineage, Dr. Ramanathan, so many others who've come from that lineage. So that is the Patnam side. So coming right down to our times, these are all names that are alive and well. So if you take one side of it, I'll finish with Ariyakudi. Puchi Srinivasa Iyengar, next slide, sorry. Yeah. So Puchi Srinivasa Iyengar's lineage, I don't have to say anything further. The greatest of them all, Ariyakudi Ramanuja Iyengar. And between them, let's stop for a moment at this point and see what was happening. So Mahavaidyanatha Sivan finalizes the 72 Melakartas which existed by creating the Mela Ragamalika. Sabesha Iyer becomes the teacher. He teaches music. He then goes on to heads the Annamalai University's music department prior to the coming of Tiger Varadacharya. So, no, after Tiger Varadacharya is Sabesha Iyer. In fact, the story goes that Tiger was retiring and V.S. Srinivasa Sastry said, Tiger kalambi ponapra yenda karadi varapordo, whereupon Sabesha Iyer said, Nanda aduthathu, and he was seated in the audience. So this was, so organized teaching of music was starting off. So the Guru Sishya Parampara, which is that Gurukula Vasam, Guru Vitla Poi Tangi, avaroda thuniya thoche, avarku vela panni, avar enna paata kathu kudukraro, that we have to learn. That was on the wane, and organized teaching of music was coming within 2 generations of Tyagaraja. So Tiger himself was heading 4 educational institutions, not 1. Sabesha Iyer was heading 1. So this was one aspect of it. I've already told you about the printing side of it. Then let's look at Ramanuja Iyengar. The great revolution that was happening around the time. See, Ramanuja Iyengar was born in 1890, and he would start performing from his 19th year. So we are looking at 1909 when he would start performing. That was the era when gramophone records had begun to flood the market. The Gramophone and Typewriter Company of England, their engineers would come to India. They would record the artists over here. They would take the discs back. It would be pressed in the factories in England or in Germany. Then the discs would come back for sale in India. So Tyagaraja compositions and other compositions were being heard in practically every household which was well-to-do. It was being heard at various other places. People were able to understand. Gramophone books were coming out. So the composition that is being sung would be available as a lyric. So you could then learn on that basis. So Ramanuja Iyengar's great contribution is he began to transform the Carnatic concert format. And he began to accommodate more number of compositions because the audience was used to a very small attention span. See, today everything, video potar 10 நிமிஷத்துக்குள்ள போடுங்க சார், இல்லாட்டா attention span குறைஞ்சு போயிடுறது. So the average audience attention today is that of an ant. But at that point of time, it was a little longer. People were wanting to hear 3.5-minute recordings. So Ramanuja Iyengar would create this number of tukadas, variety of compositions. You would have Tamil, you would have Telugu, you would sing Vaishnava Janato. So lots of compositions would begin to fit the gramophone format. From the gramophone format, it would come back into the concert format. So Musiri, his Nagumomu was the biggest hit, Tyagaraja's Nagumomu. Musiri's Nagumomu in the gramophone is 6 minutes. Musiri singing Nagumomu in a concert is half an hour. People began to demand that he should sing Nagumomu in 6 minutes. Otherwise, they were not happy with it. So the poor man began to really suffer because of that. Next slide, please. We had a third lineage from Venkat Subbayar, and that was Sharaba Shastrigal. Sharaba Shastrigal he was blind, he was a great flautist, refused to be photographed, refused to be recorded, died in his 30s. We have no idea other than the fact that he was a great star of the flute. His disciple was Palladam Sanjeeva Rao, who would then carry forward a long flautist tradition. Next slide, please. So with that we come to an end to with this slide, we come to an end of the Mahar Nombu Chavadi tradition. Susarla Dakshinamurti Shastri, whose photograph again we don't have, he would learn from Venkat Subbayar and go to Andhra. So the Vijayanagaram and those Samasthanams would listen to Tyagaraja. They would know that there was a Telugu composer over here. His disciple was Parupalli Ramakrishna Pantulu, whose disciple was M. Balamurali Krishna. So that tradition also would come from the Mahar Nombu Chavadi line. Next slide. Then we come to the Valajapet school. The Valajapet school is by two people, father and son. Valajapet Venkatramana Bhagavatar, Valajapet Krishnaswamy Bhagavatar. So here if you see the first man sitting in the front is Valajapete Venkatramana Bhagavatar. The man with the violin is Krishnaswamy Bhagavatar. And his son is K.K. Ramswamy Bhagavatar, who is seated behind him. So 3 generations, of which the first 2 directly learned from Tyagaraja. So the Venkatramana Bhagavatar lived up to the age of 92. And he went to learn from Tyagaraja sometime at the end of the 18th century. And he learned from him for almost 20-25 years. His son Krishnaswamy Bhagavatar would come down to learn from Tyagaraja in the 1840s. Towards the end of Tyagaraja's life. And he was physically present when Tyagaraja died. So, what is very interesting is, they would begin writing down Tyagaraja's compositions in notebook form, printed paper notebook. Those notebooks survive even today in the Saurashtra Sabha in Madurai. So, from palm leaf manuscripts, we are now coming to notebook. And Venkatramana Bhagavatar and Krishnaswamy Bhagavatar would both write the biography of Tyagaraja. Only 2 pages each. And if you read that, all this story, ivar anna thuki vigrata thuki potar, ivar adila poi thedinar, othan settupona, ivar odne na jeevadhara paadinar, andaalu ezhundu okkanduntan. T.S. Parthasarathy would tell me, adukapra andaalu sette poleya innu engeyadu irundittirpalle. So that kind of thing. It's very difficult to stomach all that, I can't believe it. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to demean anybody else's belief. But the point here is that they wrote a very, very factual, bare bones biography of Tyagaraja, which is all that they felt was necessary. And from that we know a few historic details of the composer. Next slide, please. Valajapet Venkatramana Bhagavatar was a weaver, Saurashtra Brahmin, Patnulu. So, they belong to the weaving community, and he would go and settle in a place called Balajapete, which is near Kanchipuram. There you have a house, and attached to the house is a Bhajana Mandiram. In 1837, Tyagaraja would begin to travel out of Tanjavur. He was 70 years old. Romba vayasayach. But he would be brought to Madras by Kovur Sundaresha Mudali, who was a very rich Dubash of Madras. During that time, he would come to Valajapete as well. And the disciples would organize a great welcome for their guru, this great man who had traveled all this distance and come. And that particular welcome happens in this place. There is even today a portrait of Tyagaraja inside this mandapam, which is worshipped every day by the family. You can go there and you can see it. Next slide. The Valajapete family was the one that retained the maximum number of physical artifacts of Tyagaraja. His Paduka, which is worshipped in the Krishna temple in Saurashtra, next to the Krishna temple in the Saurashtra Sabha in Madurai, was saved by Valajapete Venkatramana Bhagavatar, which is how we have it there. Next slide. And his tambura is in the Krishna temple in Madurai in the Saurashtra Sabha, Krishnan Kovil Street. Every day in the evening at 5 o'clock, they will open the cupboard. One side is Tyagaraja's tambura, the other side is Venkatramana Bhagavatar's tambura. They will do Deeparadhana for it, and then they will shut the doors on it. So you can, if you go there next time, you should be able to see it. The Valajapete lineage would have Mysore Sadasiva Rao as one of its disciples. When Tyagaraja came to Valajapete, he would compose Tyagaraja Swami Vedalina, which is a song that we have lost today. But he was the composer for that. His disciple was Fiddle Munuswami Appa, whose disciple was the great Bangalore Nagaratnama, who would eventually build a samadhi for Tyagaraja. Next slide. The Valajapete lineage would have a very interesting journey. So it would start from a woman whose photograph we don't have, whose name was Neelayatakshi Ammal, if I am not mistaken, and she was the mother of the man whom you see sitting in the extreme corner. He was a Chetty of Georgetown, a businessman, Jalatarangam Ramanaya Chetty, who was also a Jalatarangam performer. His mother had learned from the Valajapete school, so Ramanaya Chetty knew the compositions of Valajapete Venkatramana Bhagavatar. Kanchipuram Nayana Pillai, whose photograph you see in the middle, the man in the turban, he would learn from Ramanaya Chetty. Ramanaya would not teach people whom he thought did not deserve the compositions. So you had to really impress him with your sincerity and your aptitude and all that. Only then, very reluctantly, it would come out. The other aspect about Ramanaya was that he had, according to TTK, he had a voice like the braying of an ass. Now, how people learned music from him, I have no idea, but Nayana Pillai learnt it from him. His disciples, among the most famous, Chittur Subramanya Pillai and T. Brinda, Dhanammal's granddaughter. Dhanammal's daughter Kamakshi felt that, our family tradition is fine, but it is not suited for concert performances. If you want to learn how to perform, you have to go to Nayana Pillai. So Dhanammal, I believe, very sarcastically said, "Namba kudumbathla sangeethame illen solli anga amchirukanga." So, but Brinda went with Mukta at the age of 9 and learned music from Nayana Pillai. So the Valajapet tradition will begin entering the Dhanammal family. Next. The Thillaisthanam school, which is the second famous school of Tyagaraja, we have very little information about. All we know is that there was Thillaisthanam Ramayengar, who was very close to Tyagaraja, who was his faithful companion and disciple, who was present till he died. The Harikatha tradition would take to it, and Narasimha Bhagavatar and Panju Bhagavatar were both Harikatha artists. Narasimha Bhagavatar's student was Alathur Venkatesh Iyer. From Alathur Venkatesh Iyer, we would have Alathur Subayar, Alathur Srinivas Iyer, Tiruvengada Jayaraman, and so on and so forth. That Alathur school would come from the Thillaisthanam Parampara. Next slide. Then we have the Madras school. Veena Kuppayar learnt, Tyagaraja was just not a vocal teacher. Krishnasamy Bhagavatar was playing the violin. Veena Kuppayar was performing on the veena. Veena Kuppayar would come to Madras and become a musician under Kovur Sundaresa Mudali, that famous Dubash whom I mentioned. And it was because of Kuppayar that Tyagaraja would get invited and would be brought to Madras, which is how he composed the Kovur Pancharatnam, Thiruvattriyur Pancharatnam, then he goes to Tirupati, and then he goes to Kanchipuram and all that. Veena Kuppayar's son was Thiruvattriyur Tyagayar. And between them, they would publish books with their own compositions, based very much on the Tyagaraja style. Thiruvattriyur Tyagayar was one of the many people who taught Veena Dhanammal. So Dhanammal would again become a repository of sorts. Dhanammal, incidentally, if you went to learn music from her, you had to teach her one song in order to learn a song from her. And the ratio was, she would learn 2 songs from you and 1 song she would teach in return. So, in our stock exchange, has been there. And there are plenty of stories, but Dhanammal is another story, but we'll stop here. Next slide, please. Then we come to the most famous school of Tyagarajas, which is the Umayalpuram school. Umayalpuram, Krishna Bhagavatar and Sundara Bhagavatar. They were only 10 and 8 when Tyagaraja passed away, so they must have learnt from him when they were very, very young. And then they learned from Maharno Bichavadi Venkatasubayar, Tyagaraja's cousin. They, strangely enough, will contribute the maximum number of performing artists. So today, by and large, when you hear Tyagaraja compositions, knowingly or unknowingly, you're following the Umayalpuram school. Let's see who are all these great people. You have Umayalpuram Swaminatha Iyer, who was more a teacher. After him, Maharajapuram Vishwanath Iyer, Shemmangudi Srinivas Iyer. I needn't tell you anything more than that as to the amount of influence that the Umayalpuram school had. These Sangatis, for which Tyagaraja, they were performing artists. So for them, the Sangatis were very important. You had to hold the audience attention. And you had to have multiple Sangatis. So the Kshinamai, Chakani Rajamargamu, Marubalga, with the, that is what really thrills you at the end of the day. So these Sangatis were all the wealth of this Umayalpuram school. And they would make several compositions famous. Next slide. Now, the composing, with that, then we knew very little about Tyagaraja for a long time. Till 1947, what we knew about Tyagaraja was all these stories, this WhatsApp university kind of thing that was circulating all over the globe. And we didn't even know when Tyagaraja was born. So if you look at the accounts of Tyagaraja's life right till 1947, it will be all good people in India died at the age of 32, therefore Tyagaraja also had to die at the age of 32. There were some people who said he had lived up to the age of 100, some people said he had lived up to the age of 80, some people, so on, lot of confusion. Then in the Valajapete manuscripts which I told you about, they found a horoscope written by one of Tyagaraja's direct disciples about whom we know nothing except that he was a good performer, Tanjavur Ramarao. And he had written Tyagaraja's horoscope. From that, we were able to identify that he was born in 1767. So this is all we know about Tanjavur Ramarao. Next slide. Then we have the Lalgudi school. Lalgudi Ramayar learnt from Tyagaraja directly. Later on went to Mysore, became an Asthana Vidwan over there. And then we have had a long line coming up to V.R. Gopal Iyer, then Lalgudi Jayaraman, then Lalgudi Krishnan and Vijay Lakshmi. So that's been one tradition from the Lalgudi side. And Tyagaraja visited Lalgudi and composed 5 compositions over there as well, which are called the Lalgudi Pancharatna. Next slide. Finally, we come to the last 2 slides of this presentation. Subbaraya Shastri, Shyama Shastri's son. Shyama Shastri's son, Subbaraya Shastri, is probably the only individual who learnt from Tyagaraja, Dikshitar and Shyama Shastri. Now, whether he learnt from Dikshitar is a subject of a little doubt. At this point of time, we are not able to say it with we are not able to say it with certainty. But certainly the music, those only 12 compositions, but each composition is a gem. At the Music Academy, there was a spirited discussion once on whose compositions would you save if something happened and everything vanished. By universal acclaim, it was, we will save the 12 compositions of Subbaraya Shastri, everything else can. People can look for themselves. So because he reflects that distilled essence of Tyagaraja, Dikshitar and Shyama Shastri. All 3 of them together. Subbaraya Shastri, it is said that when he composed Ninuvina, Gatigana, Jagana and Kalyani, Tyagaraja himself was present and blessed him in the Dharma Samvardhini temple. From Subbaraya Shastri, we would have Annaswamy Shastri, who was his adopted son, Kachi Shastri, who was his son-in-law, and then we would have Tanjavur Kamakshi, who were all, Annaswamy Shastri, of course, we all know, composer in his own right, and from whom there would be a lineage of Shyama Shastri's family. Kachi Shastri, next slide please. Annaswamy Shastri would also teach 2 very well-known musicians, completely forgotten today, the Tachur Singaracharlu brothers. In the 1800s, 1880s, these were the 2 men who would publish the maximum number of books on music. Gayaka Siddhanchanam, Gayaka Lochanam, Gayaka Parijatam. All the first editions are available even today in the Music Academy Library and digitized. So people can access them at any point of time for research. So these were people who came from the Annaswamy Shastri lineage. Next slide. The Kachi Shastri lineage would give rise to Kanchipuram Dhanakoti Ammal and Kanchipuram Payani Ammal. Their nephew was Kanchipuram Nayana Pillai. So on the one side, he was learning from the Valajapete tradition. From the other side, he was learning from the Subbaraya Shastri tradition. And he probably knew the maximum number of Tyagaraja compositions. Next slide. The Tanjavur Kamakshi lineage, her granddaughter was Veena Dhanammal. So Veena Dhanam's family, at the end of the day, would have Brinda bringing in the Nayana Pillai tradition. It would have Dhanam bringing in the Subbaraya Shastri tradition, from whom Shyama Shastri tradition also came. And because they had learnt from a disciple of Dikshitar, that is Satanur Panchanada Iyer, they would also have the Dikshitar lineage coming in. It was one of the most formidable lineages in the world of Carnatic music. So this is the last slide, I think. I don't think there is a slide after. Yeah. So by the end of the Dhanammal era, 1938, music was being recorded, music was being written in notation, music was being propagated, music was being taught by educational institutions. Musicians were traveling all over India. Tyagaraja was established as the most popular composer because of the fact that his compositions lent themselves to that treatment. There is no doubt about it. Without the basic material being available, you could not have created this star composer called Tyagaraja. That is there. The other is that the opportunities that came the way of the disciple lineage and the number of disciples that he had, that would really go around making the legend that we know of today. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Thank you.